The blood had already soaked through the floorboards by the time I realized the rule was broken. The stain spread slowly, pooling into thick, black rivulets as though the house was drinking it. My sister's hand twitched once, twice, then stilled entirely, her fingers curling inward like wilted petals. I couldn't scream, couldn't move. All I could do was stare at the list of rules, now crumpled and damp in my shaking fist. The paper still read the same. Rule 5. Do not let the hallway mirror reflect the moonlight. I don't know when the moonlight first touched the glass. I hadn't even noticed it slipping through the gap in the curtains until it was too late. But now, I was the only one left to notice anything. The week before, I'd been so certain this house was going to fix everything. The inheritance was a blessing, or so we thought. My mother, desperate to leave behind the cramped apartment where rent gobbled up her paychecks, jumped at the opportunity to claim the long-abandoned house left to us by an estranged relative. A fresh start, she'd called it, her eyes brighter than I'd seen in years. My sister, Claire, had been less enthusiastic. Places like this always have strings attached, she'd muttered, eyeing the peeling paint and warped shutters as we first pulled into the driveway. There's a reason no one's lived here for decades. Don't be dramatic, Mom said, waving her hand dismissively. It just needs some love. The house loomed over us like a watchful predator, its broken shutters half closed as though guarding secrets. We'd stepped inside cautiously, and the air immediately felt wrong. Too still, too quiet. Dust coated every surface in a thin gray film, and the smell of damp wood hung thick in the air. And then we found it. The list of rules was tucked neatly on the kitchen counter, its edges yellowed and brittle. The handwriting was shaky, like it had been scrawled in a hurry, but each letter was painstakingly clear. Rule 1, do not leave the grandfather clock unwound. Rule 2, never enter the basement after dark. Rule 3, keep all doors closed at midnight. Rule 4, do not leave the windows open when it rains. Rule 5, do not let the hallway mirror reflect the moonlight. There were more, but my mother stopped reading after the 5th one. Ridiculous, she said, crumpling the list into a ball and tossing it into the trash. That night, the clock stopped ticking. I didn't notice it at first. I'd been lying awake in my room, staring at the ceiling as the floor creaked beneath my mother's restless pacing. Claire had been next door, humming a song under her breath, a nervous habit she'd picked up after Dad left. Then the humming stopped, replaced by a soft, rhythmic knock. Tap, tap, tap. I sat up, straining to listen. Claire? I called, but my voice felt small in the cavernous silence. The knocking didn't stop. It seemed to echo down the hallway, growing louder, sharper. I crept to my door, my bare feet brushing against the splintered wood. As I stepped into the hallway, the temperature dropped suddenly, and I could see my breath misting in the air. The grandfather clock stood at the end of the hall, its hands frozen at 11:47. I turned back toward Claire's room, only to find her standing behind me, her face pale. "Why did you stop the clock?" she whispered. I didn't. The knocking grew louder, faster. We rewound the clock. We didn't question it. But the next night, Claire forgot to close her bedroom door before midnight. I'd been half asleep when I heard the scraping. At first, I thought it was her moving furniture. Then came the sound of heavy breathing, wet and guttural, followed by a low, growling chuckle. When I ran to her room, the door was wide open, and Claire was standing in the middle of it, trembling. Behind her, a shadow stretched across the walls, a figure with no discernible features, only 2 pinpricks of glowing red where its eyes should have been. "I'm sorry," Claire whispered. The shadow lunged. The next morning, we found Claire curled in the corner of her room, her arms wrapped tightly around her knees. She wouldn't speak. She wouldn't even look at us. Her face was ashen, her lips cracked and dry. When I touched her shoulder, she flinched, recoiling as though my hand were made of fire. "She just needs rest," Mom said, but her voice lacked conviction. She wouldn't admit it aloud, but she'd seen the same thing I had. The faint hand-shaped bruises wrapped around Claire's neck. The list reappeared that morning, neatly unfolded on the kitchen counter, as though it had never been crumpled or thrown away. "What the hell is this?" Mom asked. Picking it up, I snatched it from her hands, reading the rules over again, more carefully this time. My heart sank when I noticed a new addition, written at the bottom in the same spidery handwriting. Rule 6. Do not speak of what you see at night. What is that supposed to mean? Mom pressed, but I ignored her. Instead, I crept back to Claire's room. She was still sitting in the corner, her body stiff as a mannequin. Her wide, unblinking eyes tracked me as I sat beside her. "Claire," I whispered. "What happened last night?" She didn't respond, not with words. Instead, she slowly turned her head toward the window. I followed her gaze and felt my stomach lurch. The glass, which had been frosted over with condensation earlier, now bore a single word scrawled in the moisture. Run. We didn't run. We couldn't. By the third night, the house had tightened its grip on us. The shadows in the corners grew darker, stretching and twisting in impossible ways. I started hearing voices, soft, whispering things I couldn't quite understand, but their tone made the hairs on my neck stand on end. Mom brushed it off, refusing to acknowledge that something was wrong. "It's just an old house," she insisted. Her smile stretched too thin. "All houses make noises." That night, it rained, and the windows stayed open. I woke to the sound of dripping. At first, I thought it was just the rain seeping through the cracks in the roof, but the sound was too close, too steady. Drip, drip, drip. I sat up in bed, my pulse quickening. The room was pitch black, but I could hear something moving just outside my door. Heavy, deliberate footsteps squelching against wet wood. I crept toward the noise, my breath hitching with each step. When I reached the hallway, I froze. The walls were streaked with water, rivulets of crimson trickling down to the floor. At the end of the hallway stood Mom, her nightgown drenched, her head tilted back unnaturally. Her mouth was open, stretched far too wide, and water poured out of it in a steady stream. Her eyes snapped to mine, and she spoke, though her lips never moved. "Close the windows." My feet refused to move. The whispering started again, louder this time, and the shadows around her seemed to swell and writhe. Her voice, layered and hollow, echoed again. "Close the windows." I bolted back to my room and slammed the door shut. The next morning, she was fine, or, at least, she seemed fine. She didn't mention the rain. She didn't mention the night. But when she walked into the kitchen, her footsteps left wet, red stains on the floor. That morning, I tried to convince Mom to leave. Claire sat silently at the kitchen table, tracing invisible patterns on the wood with a trembling finger, while I stood in front of Mom, gripping her shoulders. "We have to go," I said, my voice shaking. "This house, it's doing something to us." Mom pulled away, her face pale but resolute. "We can't just leave," she said, brushing her hair back with trembling fingers. "Where would we go? What about the inheritance? This is our home now." "It's not a home," I snapped. "It's a trap." Claire spoke then, her voice a hoarse whisper. "There's no way out." Both of us turned to look at her. "What do you mean?" I asked, kneeling beside her. Her eyes met mine, hollow and rimmed with dark circles. "The doors won't open," she said. I tried everyone." Mom laughed nervously, "but it was brittle and hollow." "Don't be ridiculous," she said, striding toward the front door. She yanked on the handle. Nothing happened. The door didn't budge. She jiggled it harder, pulling and twisting, her movements growing more frantic. Finally, she stepped back and glared at me, as though I'd somehow caused it. "It's just stuck," she said. "Try the windows," I urged. Mom hurried to the nearest one, fumbling with the latch. It wouldn't move. She tried another, and another, her panic escalating with each failure. By the time she reached the kitchen window, she was sobbing, pounding her fists against the glass. "It's the house," Claire said. Her voice was steady now, flat and devoid of emotion. "It won't let us leave." By nightfall, we were trapped. The house seemed to grow darker with each passing hour, its shadows thickening like a living thing. The air smelled metallic, like rusted iron, and every breath felt heavy in my chest. The list of rules sat on the kitchen table, mocking us with its presence. That was when Mom broke. "I'm not playing this game," she said, snatching the list off the table. She ripped it into jagged pieces, her face twisted with fury. "Do you hear me? I'm not playing!" The moment the paper tore, the lights flickered, and a low groaning sound reverberated through the house. Claire whimpered, pressing herself against the wall. "You shouldn't have done that." The groaning grew louder, deeper, like the sound of an enormous beast stirring beneath the floorboards. Then, the walls began to shudder. "Get out of the kitchen," I yelled, grabbing Claire's arm. We bolted into the hallway as the floor in the kitchen buckled, splitting open with a deafening crack. Something dark and wet surged through the opening, black tendrils that writhed and coiled like the limbs of a great, unseen creature. Mom screamed. I turned, just in time to see the tendrils wrap around her legs, dragging her toward the gaping hole in the floor. "Help me!" she cried, her hands clawing at the linoleum. I lunged forward, grabbing her wrists, but the tendrils were too strong. They pulled her down with a sickening, wet squelch, and the last thing I saw was her face, contorted in terror, as she disappeared into the dark. The floor slammed shut. Claire and I sat huddled in the hallway, the silence pressing down on us like a physical weight. "What do we do now?" she whispered. I looked at the shredded remains of the list, scattered across the floor. "We follow the rules?" I said. "Every single one." The days after Mom's disappearance blurred together in a haze of dread. Claire and I moved cautiously through the house, always clutching the rules, now painstakingly pieced back together and taped into a fragile, wrinkled sheet. We didn't know if the list's restoration had any power, or if it was just a desperate act to keep the house from noticing our defiance. Each night, the shadows grew bolder. I could feel them watching, the weight of unseen eyes pressing into the back of my skull. Claire barely spoke, her face pale and gaunt, her body trembling constantly as though her nerves were fraying one by one. The house punished small mistakes harshly. We learned that on the 7th day. The rain returned that night, and though we double-checked all the windows, one of them creaked open on its own. I heard the faint tap-tap-tap of water dripping onto the wooden floor and froze. "Claire," I whispered, shaking her awake. "Stay here." I crept into the hallway, gripping the flashlight I'd found in the attic. My heart pounded so loudly I could barely hear the rain. The open window was at the end of the hall, the curtains billowing softly. I crossed the space quickly, desperate to close it before the house noticed. The closer I got, the colder the air became, until my breath misted in front of me. Then, I heard the laughter. It was faint at first, almost like a child giggling from another room, but it grew louder, more manic, until it filled the entire hallway. I spun around, shining the flashlight in every direction, but there was nothing there, just the laughter, echoing and endless. I slammed the window shut, but the sound didn't stop. Behind me, the shadows began to move. They didn't lunge or strike, they just shifted, creeping closer like ink spilling across paper. I backed away, my flashlight trembling in my hand. "Stay away," I whispered, my voice cracking. The shadows ignored me. They crawled up the walls and over the ceiling, surrounding me completely. Then, I felt it, a cold, wet hand brushing against my neck. I ran. When I reached Claire's room, I found her standing by the bed, clutching the rules with both hands. She looked up at me, her eyes wild with panic. "It's watching us," she said, her voice barely audible. "What is?" "The house." That night, I stayed awake, keeping my eyes on the hallway mirror. Rule 5 haunted me like an open wound. Do not let the hallway mirror reflect the moonlight. It seemed simple enough. Close the curtains, stay vigilant. But the rules had a way of twisting, of turning the most mundane actions into unbearable dangers, and I was right to worry. Sometime after midnight, I heard the sound of fabric shifting. I turned toward the window and froze. The curtain, which I had tied shut with rope, was moving, slowly, methodically, as though something was pulling it aside from the other side of the glass. "No," I whispered, rushing toward it. Before I could grab the curtain, the moonlight spilled through the gap, catching the edge of the hallway mirror. The glass shuddered. I stumbled backward, my breath hitching. At first, I thought the mirror was cracking, but then I realized the fractures were moving. They slithered across the surface like veins, pulsing faintly as the reflection began to ripple. A face emerged from the glass. It wasn't mine. Its eyes were sunken pits, its mouth too wide, its skin stretched thin over a skeletal frame. It smiled at me, its teeth sharp and glistening, before reaching a clawed hand through the glass. I couldn't move. The hand slid out of the mirror with an unnatural, wet sound, its fingers impossibly long and thin. They dripped with a viscous black liquid that spattered onto the floor, sizzling where it landed. "Claire!" I screamed, finally finding my voice. The creature stepped fully through the mirror, its body unfolding like a nightmare-given form. It was impossibly tall, its limbs bending in ways that shouldn't be possible, its face frozen in that grotesque smile. The smell of decay filled the air, sour and overpowering. As it tilted its head to look at me, I backed away slowly, my legs trembling beneath me. "What do you want?" I whispered. Its smile widened, splitting its face almost in two, and it whispered in a voice that was both soft and grating, like nails dragging against glass. "You broke the rules." Behind me, Claire screamed. I turned to see her standing in the doorway, the list clutched to her chest, her eyes locked on the creature. She took a shaky step backward, her lips trembling as she tried to speak. "We'll fix it," she stammered. "We'll follow the rules." "Please don't." The creature moved faster than I could process. In an instant, it was standing over Claire, its clawed hand gripping her face. She screamed again, her voice cut short as the creature lifted her off the ground with unnatural ease. "Don't touch her!" I shouted, rushing forward. The creature turned to me, its sunken eyes glowing faintly, and I froze. It didn't need to say anything. Its presence alone was enough to root me to the spot. Claire's body convulsed violently, her limbs twisting and snapping as though something inside her was trying to escape. Blood poured from her mouth, her nose, her eyes, pooling on the floor in thick, steaming puddles. And then, with a final, sickening crack, she went limp. The creature dropped her to the floor like a discarded doll, its smile never faltering. It stepped back into the mirror, its body rippling like liquid as it disappeared. The glass solidified behind it, the fractures vanishing as though they'd never been there. I don't know how long I sat there, staring at Claire's lifeless body. The silence was deafening, the house pressing down on me like a suffocating weight. She was gone. Mom was gone. I was the only one left. The list sat beside me, soaked in Claire's blood. I picked it up with trembling hands, my vision blurred with tears. At the bottom of the page, a new rule had appeared, written in dark, spidery ink. Rule 7. The last must finish the ritual. I stared at the words, my chest tightening as a cold, sinking realization settled over me. The house didn't just want obedience. It wanted something more. I sat there for what felt like hours, clutching the bloodied list as if holding it could make any of this stop. My tears blurred the words, but they wouldn't go away. The last must finish the ritual. What ritual? I wanted to scream. I wanted to tear the house apart with my bare hands, to set fire to the cursed walls and watch it burn. But I knew it wouldn't matter. The house wouldn't let me leave. It wouldn't let me win. And now it wanted something from me. The silence in the house had taken on a weight of its own. Every creak of the floorboards, every groan of the shifting wood sounded like a voice, urging me forward. I didn't know where I was going. My legs moved on their own, carrying me through the dimly lit corridors. The air grew colder with every step, the walls narrowing until I felt as though they were closing in around me. The house was guiding me. At the end of the hallway, I found the door. It was a door I'd never seen before. A massive, heavy slab of dark wood, its surface carved with intricate symbols that seemed to shift and writhe under my gaze. My stomach churned as I reached for the handle, the metal icy against my skin. The door opened with a low, groaning sound, revealing a staircase spiraling down into the dark. I descended slowly, the light from the hallway fading with each step. The air grew damp and oppressive, the smell of earth and decay filling my lungs. My footsteps echoed in the darkness, each one sounding louder than the last. At the bottom of the stairs, the space opened into a cavernous chamber. The walls were lined with rotting wood, pulsing faintly as though the house itself was breathing. At the center of the room stood an altar, carved from the same dark wood as the door. The list of rules was waiting for me there, perfectly clean and untouched, laid out neatly on the altar's surface. Beside it sat a knife. I didn't want to go closer, but my feet betrayed me. The knife was ancient, its blade jagged and stained with something dark and sticky. I reached for it, my hand trembling as my fingers brushed the cold metal. The whispers began again. They were louder now, surrounding me, filling my head with their insistent murmur. I couldn't understand the words, but I felt their meaning deep in my bones. The ritual required a sacrifice. I sank to my knees in front of the altar, the knife heavy in my hands. My reflection stared back at me from the blade's surface, distorted and warped. The list of rules seemed to mock me, its ink shifting and writhing as though alive. Rule 7. The last must finish the ritual. I thought of Claire, of Mom, of the screams and the blood and the shadows. My fingers tightened around the knife. "I won't do it," I whispered. The whispers rose to a deafening roar, shaking the walls, rattling the altar. The air around me grew thick, suffocating, and I felt the weight of unseen hands pressing down on my shoulders, forcing me to bow before the altar. "I won't do it," I screamed, but my voice was swallowed by the house, the walls vibrating with its fury. And then the altar shifted. The wood split open, revealing something beneath, something alive, a writhing mass of shadows and tendrils, its form shifting constantly as though it couldn't decide what it wanted to be. Its presence filled the room, an overwhelming wave of dread and malice washing over me. It spoke, though its voice wasn't a voice at all. It was a feeling, a cold, piercing terror that burrowed into my mind. Finish the ritual, or take their place. The thing inside the altar pulsed, a slow, wet rhythm that seemed to sync with the pounding of my heart. Its tendrils slithered out, brushing against the floor, leaving dark, glistening trails in their wake. The choice it offered wasn't a choice at all. I gripped the knife tighter, my breath coming in ragged gasps. "Why me?" I choked out, my voice trembling. "Why us?" The room wasn't entirely empty. Against the far wall stood a clock. It wasn't the same as the one in the hallway back at the house, but it ticked with the same slow, methodical beat. I crossed the room cautiously, each step echoing too loudly in the stillness. The clock's pendulum swung back and forth, each movement driving home the finality of my new reality. I reached out to touch it, and the list burned in my other hand. The house spoke to me, not in words, but in feelings, cold, oppressive, inescapable. Its will pressed into me like a vice, reminding me that there was no escape, no rebellion. It was my turn now. I was the collector. I don't know how long I stood there, staring at the clock. Time didn't seem to flow the same way anymore. Minutes stretched into hours, or maybe hours compressed into seconds. The rules were my anchor now, the only thing keeping me tied to this strange, hollow reality. And then I heard it, the sound of tires crunching gravel. The room shifted around me, folding in on itself like a collapsing puzzle. When I blinked, I was no longer in the empty room. I was back in the house, standing in the living room as sunlight streamed through the warped shutters. Through the window, I saw them, a family of 4 stepping out of a car, their faces bright with hope. A mother, a father, 2 kids, a boy and a girl. They looked like they belonged in a commercial for perfect families, their laughter echoing faintly as they approached the front door. My chest tightened. I wanted to scream, to warn them, to tell them to run and never look back, but I couldn't. The house wouldn't let me. Instead, I found myself moving toward the kitchen. The list appeared in my hand, its surface pristine once more. A pen rested beside it, waiting. I watched as my hand moved on its own, writing the rules again in that same spidery handwriting. The ink felt alive, writhing beneath the pen as each word formed. Rule 1, do not leave the grandfather clock unwound. Rule 2, never enter the basement after dark. Rule 3, keep all doors closed at midnight. Rule 4, do not leave the windows open when it rains. Rule 5, do not let the hallway mirror reflect the moonlight. Rule 6, Do not speak of what you see at night. Rule 7. The last must finish the ritual. I wrote them all, my hand shaking with every stroke. When I was finished, the list vanished from my hand, reappearing neatly folded on the counter, waiting for the new family to find it. The door opened, and the family stepped inside. I stood in the shadows, unseen, as their laughter faded into uneasy silence. "It's a bit old," the father said, looking around at the cracked walls and dusty furniture. "It just needs some love," the mother replied, her voice hopeful. The boy wandered toward the grandfather clock, his curious fingers brushing against its surface. I wanted to scream at him to stop, to tell him what would happen if he made a mistake, but the house wouldn't let me. All I could do was watch and wait.